Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Discard for Magic, a Summoner Wars podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James or Jexic. And today we've got two guests here to discuss high-level play in general. They're going to be Profit.
Hello.
And Vexer.
Hey guys, glad to be back.
Yeah, they're both returning guests. They're both quite accomplished in the tournament scene.
So we want to just highlight a bit of how accomplished they are because it's a bit insane. Profit has 4 league wins on SW Zone's league. 1 deck building Plaid Hat win, 1 modified deck, which if you played back then, props to you. Not many people have ever played a modified Plaid Hat tournament, but 1 modified Plaid Hat tournament win, 1 base deck Plaid Hat tournament win, got all of them, got all 3, and then has 2 team base decks for Shibata Bing, Shibata Boom, and 5 straight deck building team wins, never lost, for Shibata Bing, Shibata Boom, and has also won a couple of Tortugatron's tournaments as well.
Also, he got Vexer here today, and he started off 30-0 in the league, and he's won 2 times, and then he just kind of retired. And then he's got 1 base deck Plaid Hat tournament win, 2 Tournament of Champions wins, both with the Shadow Elves, I believe. 1 Faction Masters win, I think that was with the Forged, and 1 Team Base Deck, Shibata Bing, Shibata Boom win, 1 Base Deck Singles, Shibata Bing, Shibata Boom, and of course, he has also won a couple of Tortugatron's tournaments. And I think at least one of them they had to face off against each other. So often at these last tables, you might have to go through one of these 2 guys.
So why don't you guys just start off and give us like a little bit of some general tips for people who are just trying to play at a higher level, who just really want to improve their play?
I have 3 general tips that I would say are the main things I would like to highlight. So the first one is, before the game starts, once you see the matchup, you need to come up with the strategy you're going to be following. So have a strategy, and with that I mean you need to know how, for that specific matchup, you want things to go. Right? Like what type of approach you're going to be taking with your faction, right? Like, are you going to be like super aggressive, going for an assassination, like turtling back, playing hit and run, try to take over the middle ground? Like, there's many ways in which you can try to take a game. Play avoidance, right? Like hit and run. Many factions have almost like a strategy pre-built into the theme, but even in those cases, like for example the Wayfarers or the Chosen Grove, there are slight variations that you can take into that one, right? Like for example, with the Wayfarers, sometimes you can say like, hey, the only way I win this, I have to go for the assassination. I cannot just go for an econ game. For other ones, you can say like, hey, no need to risk it. Like I can just take the econ game, win that way. I can win on resources. With the Chosen Grove, like the strategy, it's always protect the tree, right? But there are variations to that. Sometimes if you're going against a canon type of summoner, like what they call things like Swamp Orcs or Eternal Council, maybe you play like, hey, I have to burn fast through the deck to be able to get to the end stage and then just shift the tree to the left, right? So that it's harder to rely on that mass amount of damage of the cannon summoner when you're in front of their main game. Another one could be like, hey, I need to create distance. You're going maybe against the Crimson Order, so I'm just gonna play to the value, try to play every single unit, just try to retreat, and then try to win on resources at the end, right? So even in those, there are different approaches, and you need to know about them at first, right? If you just start playing and just trading and just randomly discarding and doing things like that, at the end, it's harder to be able to get the win. Then the second one I would call out is gate placement. That's one of the hardest things in this game, and it's one of the most criticals. Like, it's one of those things that you place a gate, and then that determines what you can do or you cannot do for the rest of the game, like what type of plays you can put together. It all comes down to where you place those gates or the momentum of the game. With this, an example of this is you place a gate on one of the sides, the opponent already had a unit around there, or they already had like a frontal gate, third row on that side. And then next turn, they just clog your gate, and now you're just struggling trying to remove them from that position, right? You're going to be sending units into a position that is not beneficial. You're just going to start losing resources. Those are the things you have to consider, and it's so hard because it's hard to have a rule of thumb or just follow the same location for, even if you're just playing a single faction, because you have to take into consideration the current state of the board, right? Like, one of the main things is, does the opponent already have a gate on that side? Because then if you just put it into a distance in which they can just summon something and clog your gate spot, meaning put a unit on your front gate spot, then you're going to be in a disadvantageous position for the rest of the game there. So sometimes you have to take that into consideration and put it further back just because they already put it first. Or sometimes like you just put it all the way to the front because you want to be aggressive. Or if you want to turtle out, like you're going to start thinking first row, second row. There's a lot of things to consider, but that's one of the main things you start to consider thoroughly before just planting them on the same spot. And finally, I would say, like at the end of the day, most of these games are games of resources. You have to start thinking for every card that you play, how many resources are you investing on it, even if it's a unit or an event, right? You're spending, for an event, you're spending the card. So then you have to start thinking, what am I getting in return for this card? Making sure that you're always at least getting what you put into the card, right? Like you expect to get more out of a 3 magic unit than to a 2 magic unit, right? Like you need to get more attacks out of it for it to pay for itself or for the event, right? Like you need to at least be getting some enough value out of it. If you're just getting like +1 dice from a card, like maybe it's not even worth it, right? At that point. So you have to consider there, you're getting those cards to pay for themselves. So if you're just summoning a 2 magic unit, sending it to attack in a position that he's going to get attacked through multiple flanks and get destroyed the next turn, and you're losing on that battle of resources, right? Like the scales are not going your way, and that's just going to keep adding up turn after turn. At the end of this game, what you want is after every turn, you're going to be putting together a plan, and that plan is going to try to be maximizing the resources that you have and the value you can get out of those resource expenditure, meaning the 2 magic that you paid for a unit, like what's the best use that I can get out of this attack, and then how many attacks do I need to get out of this unit for that unit to justify the amount of magic that you paid. Because of that, then each turn it's putting together a plan to maximize those resources and try to be in a position, because this is also a positional game, in which the opponent will have a hard time doing the same on their end, right? Like maximizing the resources that they're spending on the board. I would say those are the 3 main general tips that I could give, right? To try to improve the way you play and maximize your odds of winning a game.
Those are great tips, Vexer. Unsurprisingly, my tips are pretty similar too. I probably should have consulted with you on what our tips were, but I think one of the more important parts you highlighted is something I wanted to bring up, which is, gates are fundamentally an important part of the game. Everyone gets the starting 10 a gate, and then you get 3 more. You'll quickly realize how important gates are when you play a game where you don't draw into one. Positioning is extremely crucial, especially for your first gate. I tend to try to keep my gates to the side when I'm playing factions that are more ranged focus. So maybe a ranged summoner or a faction that has a heavier emphasis on ranged units. I see that sometimes people tend to place gates to stagger them, which is a generally good strategy. However, it sometimes blocks off a lane for your summoner or your units to shoot down. You want to be careful, especially against factions that tend to be more aggressive or need to approach the enemy summoner, to not let them utilize your gates as sort of a shield. Typically, I try to keep my first couple of gates with the ranged factions to the side. Otherwise, I'll stagger them to kind of maximize the summoning spots. For factions that tend to be more aggressive, that like to push up into the midfield or even onto the enemy side of the board, one crucial thing to do is to make sure you can support that offense with some sort of gate. I know sometimes we get into the habit of drawing gate and immediately wanting to place it down somewhere. And I'd say for the first that you draw, you probably do want to put it down so that you can have more units on the board. However, I think if you're thinking about walking over to the other side of the board, you should consider maybe holding on to your 3rd or 4th gate so that you can drop it down next to your summoner and easily reinforce that offensive position. And if you can, try to block off the front summoning spot of maybe their 10 gate or another gate, so that you can not only reinforce and protect your gate, forcing them to kind of go around it to attack it, but at the same time, you're reinforcing that front position that you need to hold when you're making a push. And I'd say the last thing I want to talk about gates is destroying gates is actually more impactful than you may think. I feel like we tend to get into this pattern of thinking that attacking a gate may not be a good use of our resources, especially I think when you think about the first 10 health gate you get for free, we may not want or feel inclined to invest a lot of resources into taking it down. However, if you see that they place a very aggressive, I don't know, forward gate that's 5 health, you almost have to think of it as just another maybe 2 cost unit where that, has 5 health. If you take down 1 or 2 of their gates, suddenly their options are pretty limited and you have more control over the board. So not only is taking down extra gate a pretty vital strategy sometimes, but protecting your own gates from getting destroyed is also crucial. That sort of goes along with gate placement and everything, but it is really kind of how you step into the next level of play is where do I put my gates? How do I protect my gates? And how do I get rid of their positional advantage? The other tip I have is sort of along the lines of what Vexer said. It goes into kind of a matchup strategy where you think about, okay, going into this matchup, what cards do I want to play? What strategy do I want to have? And what goes along with that is sort of discard management. I think that it's a pretty unique mechanism in this game where you always draw up to 5 and you build magic by discarding for magic. I tend to follow a couple of key rules when I'm thinking about how do I manage my hand, such as I try not to hold events for too long. If I don't see myself playing an event for the next 1 or 2 turns, I feel like it's generally a better bet to discard it for magic. Units are more impactful on the board from the get-go. Events to me feel more like a force multiplier. So a lot of events will require some sort of units on the board to synergize with them. If you don't have units on the board, you probably aren't going to get a lot of use out of that event. So if I need magic, especially when I get closer into the end game, I tend to discard events in favor of building magic for units. And something I learned as I play the game more and more is that you kind of have to be very careful towards the bottom, let's say 10 cards of your deck. As you're reaching the end game, every card becomes crucial. And I think that's even more true when you think about kind of games that are very close and tight in terms of resource management. And so I tend to not discard any units under 10 cards. But at the same time throughout the game, I want to make sure that I don't ever really end a turn with 0 magic. Not only is that just not generally a good strategy for most decks outside of maybe Cave Goblins or other 0 cost decks, it gives too much advantage to your opponent when they know that you don't have the resources to respond. So they can take more aggressive strategies, they can take more aggressive positions, and know that you really can't punish them that much. So even just having 1 or 2 magic is enough of a bluff that may make them rethink taking a more aggressive strategy or getting greedy with their position. I tend to try to discard enough to have a magic to summon a unit or play an event. But if I find that maybe I already have 3 or 4 units on the board, or even 2 and then my summoner, I may rethink my discard strategy if I have enough units to attack and move with the following turn. And I think that's a even better use case when you get into the end game where you're kind of limited on the amount of cards left. So I try to kind of keep that balance of, okay, do I have 1 or 2 magic to make sure I can respond to a board state I might not be ready for? And does my current board state support my next turn? And then kind of manage, do I discard or not based on that? And I guess just to kind of round it out, I'd say the last tip I have is be flexible with your strategy. I know Vexer kind of mentioned, okay, you want to understand your faction, your matchup, your strengths, your weaknesses. We tend to get into a pattern of playing factions the same way over and over again. But really, the game is pretty well balanced enough to where that can change just based on one good or bad roll. If you see an opportunity to potentially 2-turn checkmate your opponent, crowd them, or get an assassination attempt, don't be afraid to dedicate resources to that and be flexible. And the same goes vice versa, right? Like if you are taking an assassination attempt, but then that didn't work out, try to figure out how you can recoup from that. You don't necessarily have to commit everything into that assassination attempt if, let's say, you rolled poorly. So you'd always kind of want some sort of backup strategy of, hey, if this doesn't work out, what do I do to make sure I can kind of get the game back into my hands? I'd say those are my general tips for people who want to kind of improve their gameplay.
Yeah, so those were some great points that I just wanted to also comment on those. So on the hand management, that's probably after gates or just along gates, one of the hardest parts of this game, right? As you always have to consider one of the most important parts there is to have enough magic to have a credible threat towards the opponent so that they are not able to simply overcommit or overextend because they know you cannot really do some of the dangerous things those decks could do. But if you always have like the rule of thumb, I would say there is at least be able to summon 2 units, right? Something, have enough magic for 2 units, which varies by deck. Because it's very likely that in their turn, they might just kill all the units you have out there. And if you want to be able to at least have, you want to have enough things on the board to be able to get 3 attacks, because otherwise you're going to start falling back on the resource game. That last point you were saying about the strategy, that was also a great thing to mention. Like, because I only said, like, yeah, have a strategy, but the reality of this game, and one of the reasons why it's such a great game, I think, is that you just have to adapt to the draw and the way that the discard happens, and then you just keep drawing up to 5. Like, you're always going to be restricted by what the deck is giving you. So even though you might maybe have a strategy to be aggressive, if the deck is not giving you gates, it's really going to be hard to be aggressive, right? As you were saying, the gates are an essential part of mounting an effective aggression, of going into the opponent's side of the board. It's hard to sustain that without gates. Putting pressure on that side, you need to start summoning out of that side. So if the deck is not giving you any gates, then even if though your strategy was to be aggressive, then you will have to adapt and change that strategy into maybe just fight it on the middle of the board until I see the gate. And maybe that never shows up until the end of the game, so you just had to completely change the strategy. So yeah, that flexibility to adapt, it also depends on what the opponent is doing. Like, maybe it's a defensive deck, but they're just coming at you, so you just change your strategy and go for the assassination. So that's a great addition to that. Yeah, have a strategy, but then be flexible with the tactics from the turn after turn to adjust the strategy based on how things are going. Another example is if they're just killing you with the rolls, you're really far behind on the econ. Maybe you just go all in and just try to see if you can get like a quick kill and an assassination, because you know that the original strategy of winning the econ is just going nowhere, right? So you have to adapt and change.
That brings up an interesting point. One thing I've noticed, because people joke about me kind of being extremely aggressive and going for the summoner a lot, and I find that in response, players often just go for my summoner because I've kind of painted them into that corner, having to do that, you know?
I think we're entering a meta game now where I'm playing my opponent, not my opponent's faction.
Yeah, first you have to play mind games with your opponent, and then once you're done with your mind games, then you can play the actual game, you know?
Yeah.
No, but I think you guys brought up a lot of great points. I want to touch on a couple of them. Profit, well, you were mentioning using gates as a protective device, using your opponent's gates as a protective device. And I think that's something that people don't often think about. But if like a lot of factions can really nestle themselves up against an opponent's gate, that is like protection from your opponent's units, and often it can really be beneficial, especially if you have like summoner that can bounce back and forth, like an Eternal Council or Swamp Orcs. And those summoners both hit very hard and have a way to get back to that spot in front of the gate, essentially making them safe again, or safer than they were in that other spot. And it can be very hard to deal with for other factions. Often people, when they have a gate in front of them and have an extra attack, think, oh, I should be spending this extra attack to break down this gate. And sometimes that's the case. But sometimes I've seen, even at very high level play, someone will hurt a gate, not destroy it. But then that leaves an opening for the opponent to destroy their own gate, and then get that final damage on the summoner that they needed to win the game. So something to be mindful of.
I've seen that multiple times where you're like, oh, I'll just throw this attack on the gate when you're not really thinking about it. And it's like, oh, now it's got 3 health. It can be destroyed, and I no longer have this to block for me.
A tip people often give new players is you should be using all your attacks, which can be beneficial depending on the faction, but make sure those attacks are going to benefit you. Sometimes, especially with certain factions, using just 1 or 2 attacks, but making sure you're not in a position where opponent can really respond to you, whether you're playing as like a Crimson Order or a Vanguards or a Swamp Orcs, and you use 1 or 2 like very direct attacks, but save that last one, not threatening any of your units into their side, not giving them good options for them to respond. Sometimes that's stronger than pushing a unit up and using all 3 of your attacks, or like attacking their gate and creating an opening for them.
Exactly. That's a great advice there because at the end of the day, in that game of resources, if you rolled 4 dice, only a single attack, 3 dice, but then you leave them in a position in which they will only able to throw like 1 or 2 or whatever less, then you're still winning, right? Even you didn't like do 3 and 8 dice or 9 dice. So that's where you want to be, really. You just want to be rolling more than the opponent. And that usually is going to mean that you're going to be getting more resources in your favor.
Yeah, I guess the next question we had was one I had for Vexer in particular, but could be applicable to Profit too, is that I noticed early on you told me that you used to watch a lot of other people's games, some of the higher level play. Do you think that that helped? And like, is there any like specific place you'd look to watch games?
Yeah, I used to do that a lot. I still do it in tournaments. Go and check out the finals, the semifinals, or just some of the like best players. It's always entertaining to see how they approach different matchups. It really helps a lot because especially when you're starting, right? Like you haven't played most of the matchups. Like you really don't know what's the best approach for them, or even you haven't played most of the factions, right? You don't know what's the optimal way of playing the themes of those factions. So that's one of the best ways of learning them. Like sometimes even still when new factions come out, when I'm playing other people and see how they play that faction, it gives me a lot of ideas of, oh yeah, this works better than what I was doing here or what I was doing there. It's always fun to see the different styles and the different approaches that people take. So yeah, it's still something that I do. Usually it's the easiest ones to watch our PSG events, the replays. I don't like the ones when they give you the spoiler, right? So that's what I love about some of the Tortugatron events. Like he does put the spoiler free section. And then it's more entertaining because I don't know. I just find it. I kind of understand more the appeal of esports after watching a game that you really enjoy, like this one. I find it really entertaining just watching those high level games. And the other one's the league games. Every now and then I just take a peek there to see if there's some like replays to watch.
I agree. I think those are great places to look. I'm the same way. I think when I first started playing the game, the resources were kind of limited as far as like Summoner Wars knowledge, right? I was craving kind of more, let's call it educational content. So I'm really glad now we have all these different podcasts and streams and a lot of good content creators for the community. Back in the day when I first started playing the game, it was mostly league games that I watched. I'm not quite sure if they had the official Plaid Hat tournaments yet. So I would like to just kind of peek at sort of the Division 1, Division 2 games. And those are very insightful. I think now where I probably would like to go to see games are those that are, I guess, commentated or have those post-game interviews, because I think having that element of commentary, especially coming from the players themselves, is way more enriching of a learning experience for me. And I'd say for a lot of new members, watching high level games are great. You get to kind of see what people are doing with each faction and how they're responding to certain situations. But taking it a step further and being able to kind of talk to them after the game and say, hey, for this particular turn, we noticed you decided to do this instead of this, or maybe you held this card or you didn't play this card, and kind of picking apart their brains as to the logic behind their decisions, I think adds so much more to the learning process than watching the game. And so I definitely think that watching a lot of high level plays and games is one of the best ways to improve. And I would probably even recommend just checking out all of the great content that's been put out there. I know Ben used to stream, and there are lots of different tournaments that are being kind of recorded and commentated on top of that. And so I'd say that those are great resources and definitely kind of help stepped up my gameplay when I'm thinking about how do I elevate my play style and my plays to kind of just get better by each match.
Yeah, I think those are definitely some good places to look. Ben, while not actively streaming, still has a lot of great YouTube videos of different showdowns and people who afterwards of people talking through their turns, talking through their thought processes. I know they did that a little bit with Faction Masters too, with Clarissimus. Those are also on YouTube. Those videos, I think, just give you having that mindset, like you said, of seeing a high-level player and seeing what they're thinking in their thought process, and other like players questioning them of like, why did you do this? What'd you think in this moment? Gives you more insight than just watching a game, and that can really be helpful.
I totally agree. Yeah.
What do you guys think about having sparring partners? I know Vexer, you for a while used to spar a lot with Shampoo. I don't know if you still do, but what do you guys think about having like a designated sparring partner that you play a lot of matchups with? Like, do you think that helps a lot?
Yeah, it definitely helps a lot when you're playing competitive games because, well, the first time you play a specific matchup, it's very likely, if you've never played it, that you're going to be making mistakes, right? Or you're not going to be following the ideal strategy that particular matchup could have. And that's one of the things that I used to try to do with Ben, right? In one of their streaming series on the league matchups in which we would play it a few times to try to determine what was the ideal strategy. And the difference between when you play the first one and for you played it like 2 or 3 times is just massive. Like it really makes a big difference. So yeah, doing that for competitive, it's definitely significant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think having a sparring partner is just general good form in terms of, practice makes perfect, right? And to Vexer's point, there's a lot of nuances in specific matchups that you may not even have considered if you never practiced. I remember High Elves first came out and I was just playing a couple of practice matches with them. Something I realized was that playing against Fallen Kingdom, you probably don't want to use Sanctity. It gives them 2 cards for the price of 1. And it just overall is these kind of things you don't realize until you're like, oh wow, I played this practice match, or having a consistent partner to be able to kind of explore these matchups and explore certain strategies is helpful. And I think again, this kind of goes back to the whole point of having a conversation about the game tends to be more educational than the game itself. I find that even playing against, people of all sorts of experience, they tend to have certain viewpoints or perspectives that kind of give you a different take on maybe a certain matchup or a certain faction. So agree here that, yeah, having a sparring partner, I mean, just anyone, right? Like you can find a person you've faced in the league or maybe just having a friend to play with. I remember I started playing this game with a real life buddy when we picked up a board game somewhere when this game released. Just having someone consistently to practice with, it goes a long way.
And I would tell like people who still haven't really met anyone that plays this game online or they haven't been chatting with anyone. In Discord, you could always just in the matchmaking channel, like see if anyone is up for a specific matchup that you want to try. Or after you've chatted with a few people that you've played, like what I used to do when I started in the league is really just start pinging some of the people which I had chatted when we had played the game, and it was like, oh, that was an amazing great game, that was great, and then just start pinging people, hey, are you up? Do you want to practice this one? I think Aaron, at some point, I pinged you that way, and sure, Jaxic, maybe we did the same at some point in the league if we cross paths. Eventually, like you're gonna find some people who are up for some games and be able to practice that way.
I think Vexer would just ping me when he didn't have a lot of time. He wanted to get the games over quickly,
I would always ping you just because I love how you would play fast. I would also play fast, so I knew like, hey, we could get like like the matchup going in like an hour, right? In 2 hours, like we would finish like a pair of matchups. So yeah, I used to ping you often now that I remember because of that. I used to ping a lot of people because sometimes for that week's game on the league, like I wanted to play it a couple times, so I wouldn't know who would be up for a game. So I would just play like a handful of players to see who would be up for it. And that's how I ended up playing with Shampoo so much because he was also looking for someone to play and he was always available, right? It's a classic one in which the people who usually are available, you end up playing more with them. The ones who are like, I cannot make it, like eventually you stop pinging them. It's just how things go.
Yeah, I think another aspect related to the matchups is, so anybody who doesn't know, SW Zone, run by Massimo, has tons of great tools, whether it's a game log analyzer or a dice simulator, just to like test out your odds and see how things are going in your game. But I think one of the aspects of that league that the site's for that people don't realize is it's one of the best places to learn a matchup because you can see both sides. So you can take a look at Profit's games and say, well, Profit won as the Filth versus the Cloaks. How did he play a matchup? And then you can also take a look from the other side. So Profit, having played this matchup, also gets to play the other side, and you can see how he approaches the Filth as the Cloaks. It gives you both aspects from a very high level of play and allows you to see the mindset of these players in both sides of the matchup, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, agreed. Whenever I have a late start on my league games and other people have kind of completed their matches, I tend to just take a peek at other people's league matches to see how like get an idea of what I should be doing too. So it's even at the highest level of plays, you're gonna always be thinking, okay, how can I tackle this? And there isn't such a thing as no room for improvement. So even I just kind of peek at other people's league game and say, okay, well, I see this person did that. Maybe I should think about doing that.
Yeah, I do the same thing. Really, that's the best way. Many times in the league, I would when you have no clue about like, well, how do I start this? Many times I was like, well, what would Massimo, what would Profit do? Even though Profit, your games were always the last ones to finish, so it was
Yeah.
usually not available to watch. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm too busy watching other people's games.
You can watch my games as either like a canary in the coal mine or a cautionary tale. I don't know, because I often finish early.
Yeah, exactly. But with your games, it's usually like I know what's gonna happen. Like, oh, Yax is gonna rush in and just try to like go in for it.
We don't need to go too deep into my league issues. So far, I'm doing better in Division 2 again, but yeah, Division 1 was rough for me.
Division 1 is its own beast. I was talking to Bean the other day, and we were talking about how the first time in Division 1 can just be like pretty rough. And I was telling him that many a time I've been like 1-9, I think, in Division 1, 2-8, 3-7. Division 1 is rough, man.
Yeah.
Bringing up Massimo's league brings you to a general question, which I don't think we put on the list, is how helpful do you think it is to play a variety of factions to even play any given faction well? Do you think it helps to know what all the factions can do from their perspective to give you a better way to play each matchup?
Yeah, definitely. Like to be able to play against a faction, the best way is if you've played them, like you know what hurts them, right? Like you know which positions. Like when you've been that faction and you've been in those positions, then when you go against them, you know, like yeah, like don't like when you do this or that. So knowing the factions is one of the basic things of this game, right? So that one I wouldn't say it's like the advanced play, because if you're getting into the high level play competitive, it has to be a given that you know all the cards in the different decks and the things that they can do, because otherwise like it's hard to stand a chance. You're gonna get surprised about like the things that they do in those games. So yeah, mastering most factions, or at least the ones that you're gonna be facing in competitive, or at least being aware of the main things they can do. Like at that point, for example, if you're facing a faction you've never played against, you can just go and watch in the tournaments like a few games of high level players, higher groups, or the finals with those factions to try to see how they are played and know what to expect, right? Because if you start getting the surprises while you're playing against them, then it's going to be tough to beat them.
I sort of really value the league experience for that reason. I think forcing you to play a specific matchup on both sides just goes a really long way in terms of like teaching you some fundamentals that aren't apparent when you play the game in other forms. Because I think, again, we have a tendency to stick to our comfort zone. So we will pick, a handful of factions that we feel good with, or maybe a handful of factions that all have similar play styles. So, maybe Jexix is a cave, goblins, wayfarer, in your face player. It's also important to kind of understand all aspects of the game. And so when you're playing these league matchups, you're not only forced to step out of your comfort zone, but you have to do it in both respects of I'm playing this side and I'm playing the other side. And so you start to learn, okay, like I can't be as aggressive with, maybe polar dwarves. I need to learn how to kind of slowly build up my fortress or my hand. And so I think that goes a long way in terms of like teaching you other factions that sure, you may not really want to play in a tournament or you may not touch, but playing that faction will teach you something fundamental to the game, such as how do you steadily gain an econ advantage, which I think is a very transferable thing to factions that you end up playing because you're comfortable with. I think having those different perspectives, especially in the league format, is valuable in terms of improving your game.
I think another aspect of that is playing other factions can help you understand how to beat them. And I often will suggest to players who are struggling with a different faction, often it's like Crimson Order or Fungal Dwarves, different factions that if you play as the faction and learn the faction a bit, that will help you learn how to beat them. Because you'll find that the players who often do the best against factions are players that are very well versed with that faction. I do fairly well against Fungal Dwarves. I'm very well versed in Fungal Dwarves. I know their weaknesses. I've played them a ton of times. And so I'm very aware of when I can exploit them and when I can like stay back and let them come to me. And so playing different factions in that aspect will just give you more insights as to when you play against them, how you can exploit different aspects, what are their weaknesses, where can I do different things, and how can I get to their summoner, how can I get past their different units and abilities. So I think that can give you a whole nother layer to your game.
Yep, agreed.
Speaking of matchups, how often do you guys think of matchups before you enter or play a tournament? When you're picking your factions, how much do you place, like thought process wise, into what matchups you might encounter?
I think about it all the time. I find that like a lot of, let's call it S tier, but I use this term very loosely because, again, I think the game is decently balanced. But a lot of the top tier factions that tend to dominate the meta are factions that just don't really have a lot of specifically bad matchups. You generally tend to play factions that not only you're comfortable with, but you feel are very powerful in terms of like how do they stand against all sorts of different strategies. And I think, again, we kind of touched on this earlier, right? There is, value to being a versatile faction and having flexibility in your strategy. So a lot of strong factions nowadays, and even part of the new release, I think the Filth is one of the most versatile factions I've ever seen, is that you kind of adapt to the board state, you adapt to your matchup. And so when I think about kind of the factions I want to play in a tournament, I ask myself, how do they handle sort of different types of decks? Are they weak to aggression? Are they, not great at economy? And then I kind of marry that up with how good I feel or how comfortable I am with each of these decks. And so matchups are pretty significant in this game in terms of, how your game's going to go. And so I tend to pick factions that have different answers to different factions or different board states and strategies. And I try to avoid factions that are very weak to a particular style of gameplay. It's going to come up a lot. And I feel like if you ask any top player, they're going to say the same thing, that like matchup is fundamental to how the game's going to go. And so you have to kind of think about it every time.
In my case, I would say you do have to consider if they have horrible matchups, like some of those in which like you won't stand a chance. But the thing is, there are so many combinations today. That's why I don't think about that much. Like I just think about raw power at this point, just thinking about which are the top like A plus, S tier factions. And then usually the ones that are at that level is because they don't have like very bad matchups, right? Like the ones that don't rely on like just a specific strategy, what you were saying, right? Like they're versatile in which they can play in different ways, or they can play in ways that are not risky, right? Like some of the challenges that some factions have is the ones that rely the summoner to be in the middle of the action is that, well, there are many factions that can get around those blockers and just kill you fast. Yeah, the S tiers tend to have those advantages, like some, I guess, the theme advantage in which they don't have to take so many risks, or they have a lot of versatility to different board states or different factions, or they don't have horrible matchups. At first, I would really also pick a few, the ones that I really like to play. And yeah, and the last one, I really just picked which I'll just grab some of the strongest ones and not think about specific matchups too much.
And if you've kind of seen my faction entries, I tend to pick the same faction for every tournament. Generally the same factions, and that just kind of goes to like, yeah, there actually is so many different matchups. You're not going to be able to consider who has the best shot matchup wise. So you should always just pick the factions you feel are your strong suit, that fits your playstyle, that you're comfortable with. Even if, the community at large thinks, oh, this faction isn't as strong, it's all really about the pilot. But in this game, you don't really get to see your opponent's matchups before it actually is set up, especially in, I don't know, like the Plaid Hat tournaments. But definitely how you play each faction is going to be extremely different just based on certain matchup strategies. I know, Aaron, you were playing, I think, the Crimson Order against Fallen Kingdom one game, and we were talking about it. And, there's a general strategy for the Baron to kind of just drop a cultist in front of him over and over again, sort of just to protect him. But against Fallen Kingdom, that generally is not a great idea because it ends up being kind of fodder for carriers or just, easy targets for the Fallen Kingdom to trigger a lot of death abilities. And so you may reconsider just dropping so many cultists to protect yourself and maybe just kind of approach it differently than you would. Of course, you would pick the Crimson Order because you're comfortable with it. But again, I think the matchup consideration then spills over into that how you actually play the game.
Yeah, and to close out with this, like, this is one of the reasons why I have been like stepping away a bit about competitive play. The fact that we only have a handful of top factions that are able to really have a significant edge, right, when you're playing. So I've been one of the biggest proponents of trying to balance the game, right? Like the game getting some balanced updates, even in tournaments. I mean, we get something like that. There's really no constant adjustment, right, to try to find like a good value so that you can go into this events just picking whatever faction you like the ones that you have the most fun with, and then still have a chance. Right, like that's the issue. Like you might like a faction, but no one really likes just getting destroyed all the time because the faction just is not able to compete. Like you really don't have a chance. So that's one of the things that I would really love to see, in which we had either a mode in which we can play with cards which have their power adjusted, or have a mode in which we can do custom cards, right? Like in which you can do custom adjustments of the different values to be able to create that type of meta game in which all the factions stand at least a realistic chance against each other.
The balance overall is pretty solid. I mean, there might be one or two factions like at the bottom and the top that are slightly above or slightly below the rest and don't have that realistic chance, but most of the factions against most of the other factions have a very good chance. There's definitely occasional bad matchups. Like we've talked about Cave Goblins versus Crimson Order before. Tough one for the Cave Goblins to get past. But if you're playing a faction, now there's 26 factions out. And if you're playing a faction and they have like one or two of those matchups, I don't think that should dissuade you from picking that faction, unless maybe it's like the most picked faction in the game at the moment. But besides that, I think for the most part it's fairly balanced.
It does seem like the to go all the way. I mean, it just depends on what you consider success in a tournament. I tend to win the first or advance from the first round every time, but then getting to that last round is a bit harder for me. I mean, it's probably just some of my failings as a player, but also I think I tend to just pick the factions that I like, and I like this time I picked like Cave Goblins, Wayfarers, Obsidian Dwarves, and Savannah Elves. And the only faction I've won every one of my games with is the Savannah Elves. So which is usually considered a stronger deck.
Yeah, and I know certain high level players myself will not pick certain decks that I think are like falling out of. Like I used to pick Fungal Dwarves, for example, almost every tournament, but I think there's too many bad matchups for Fungal Dwarves now, and so I think while I still can win with Fungal Dwarves, it gives me a worse chance than some of the other decks. So I've moved away from like picking Fungal Dwarves. So I think those are different mindsets you can have of like think about different decks. But honestly, playing what you're comfortable with and what you're best with is often a better edge than playing the top deck.
Yeah, agreed.
Do you guys feel that players fall into a rhythm when they're playing a deck where they like always play the same cards, like champs and events? You go into a deck, for example, Fallen Kingdom, you're like, I always play Pyre. Like, I can't discard Pyre. I need Pyre to win the game. I always play Pyres. And do you think that can really hurt play? Do you think you should always go into a deck super flexible? Or do you think it's good to have some preconceived notions of like, I won't play any champ but Dragos in Fallen Kingdom because the other ones aren't as good, stuff like that. How do you think these preconceived notions can help or hurt somebody learning to play at a higher level?
I think that is a pretty common thing you're going to see, especially with people who maybe are new to a faction or maybe new to the game. Yeah, they tend to have a preconceived notion of, okay, this is the best champ or these are must-play events. I gave a good example earlier of High Elves, right? Like, one of their bread and butter is to kind of get Valeria to gain value over time with her ability. And to do so safely, you're going to almost always want to play both copies of Sanctity. But sometimes, and there are specific matchups, the opposing summoner may get more value out of Sanctity than you. Fallen Kingdom being one of those summoners, you may need to reconsider, okay, like in a lot of games, you're going to want to play Sanctity, but in this specific matchup, you may want to consider leaving that behind and going a different route. I take it with a grain of salt because there will be times where you probably do want to play it. So it's going to really depend on the specific matchup and the board state you're in. But more often than not, players should be evaluating the specific matchup, their general end game strategy, how they think they're going to win, and then kind of tailor their card selection based on that. Another example is, let's say you're playing against a Cannon Summoner deck. Maybe you're playing against Eternal Council or Swamp Orcs. You may want to reconsider playing champions at all because they tend to be very expensive for the most part, and against decks that have very strong ways to kind of pump up damage onto the summoner or one unit, you could easily lose that investment in a turn, making it kind of not a great strategy. Certain decks are weak to swarms, right? Maybe Wayfarers doesn't have ways to get more than 3 attacks in. And so rather than putting all your resources into 1 or 2 big units, which Celeste can maybe clear off with a lucky roll, you may want to think about just kind of throwing out more medium-sized or lower cost units so that you can slowly advance the board. And so you're going to have to rethink how your deck is going to be the vehicle you need it to be to get to the end game that you need it to get to in order to win, is what I would say.
I agree there. And a part of what I mentioned is having a strategy, like one of the actual concrete steps of what is building that strategy is this card evaluation, like determining from all your cards, which are the ones that you want to prioritize in that matchup. Like the ones that you say, like, yeah, I'm going to play every single copy of this one. Which ones are the ones that, yeah, I might play a couple. Which ones are auto discards? Like, oh, yeah, this one, no way. Like, I'll just drop it immediately for Magic. Same thing with the champions. Like, a lot of the champions are situational. So you determine, like, which ones are good for this matchup, which ones are just unplayable for this matchup. Those were some good examples, right? Like, others I can think of is that are good examples of this is Ember Mage of the Phoenix Elves. Like, that's a card that traditionally, when you play Phoenix Elves, like, you discard most of those, right? You play maybe a couple, you discard most of them. But then if you think on a per matchup basis, like, for example, when you're going against the Tundra Orcs, then, like, it becomes much better, right? Like, that one, oh, I might play, like, almost all of them, maybe. But when you're going against Sand Goblins, which they have a lot of point damage, like, it's automatic discard. Like, you never want to be playing any of those because it's not going to be paying off the 1 magic you spent for it. That's a key part of improving your gameplay, of starting, like, having high-level gameplay. That's part of the strategy definition. Before you start, you want to know which cards you're going to be focusing on, which ones you're going to be not really giving that much of a priority.
Touching on these preconceived notions from a different aspect, we noticed when we were prepping for this episode that neither of you played first edition. Do you think this has helped you not have any like preconceived notions coming into second edition? Do you think it's hurt you because you didn't have the knowledge going into the game? Or has it not really had any effect?
Well, from the stories that I've heard, like some of them from you guys about first edition, I would say it probably helped us because the game seemed really weird in first edition. Like that concept of just killing your own units and just hiding back and accumulating magic. I hear all that stuff that is said about the game, and it gives me no curiosity about like trying it out or seeing it or even see how it worked. It just sounds like a broken game, right? Like a game which, from the strategic perspective, it wasn't well thought out. You ended up with all those weird interactions. So it feels like it was probably better not having those like preconceptions.
I'm probably in the same boat. This kind of thing is hard to measure. I don't know what I don't know, but I feel like starting out, I did feel at a disadvantage playing against players, especially in a more competitive scene, that have had that experience in first edition. Obviously, they understood a lot of different things that are, the game has changed in a lot of healthy ways, but there's still some core concepts. And having that kind of background knowledge of like, how to position your units so that you can maximize damage and minimize risk, gate placement, all that. That's sort of why I was like, oh man, I really wish there was a lot more educational content in terms of how do I improve my gameplay, because I'm now facing players in a competitive format that have had the benefit of playing this game before, these types of game before. But I would say that even though you kind of get some background knowledge starting out in the game, it's definitely not a significant edge. A lot of the concepts you can kind of pick up on quickly. And I think Vexer and I are good examples of, hey, we didn't play first edition, but maybe we come from, I think Vexer might have played Magic. We come from different card game backgrounds. And so we understand, on the surface level, resource management, tempo, economy, all of that. It's just learning how to translate that onto a Summoner Wars grid that suddenly becomes a little bit more difficult, not having come from first edition. Outside of that, I'd say you can pretty much pick up a lot of these things without having played first edition. I was curious. I was visiting my girlfriend in Boston. One of the things we decided to do was go to a board game cafe. And there were just a lot of different board games. And one of the things that I found was Summoner Wars First Edition. I think I played the First Edition Cloaks I forgot what faction she played, but I was curious. The game felt very similar and familiar, but also very different. Like, I'm not used to rolling d6s, counting numbers, and I'm glad the game is where it currently is. Yeah, it's fun to check out, but I definitely prefer the tightness of the gameplay in the second edition by far.
Yeah, Aaron, I guess should we answer that from the other side of whether we think that it hurt us or from because we both played first edition?
Yeah, it would be good.
Sure, go for it, James. You take it away, and I'll follow you.
Yeah, I think definitely at first, a lot of us were first edition players, so maybe it wasn't that apparent at first. But I find in general, I tend to like playing champions more than is wise. And even though now I've played more games of second edition than I ever played of first edition, I think I maybe had 1,500 or so games of first edition. And I probably have, double or triple that now of second. I still think I often try to summon more champs than is wise, because in the first edition, your commons were so weak that you tended, for most factions, you tended to discard or kill all your own commons just to play all 3 champions every game. And I still have games now where I'll have played 3 or 4 champions in the Sand Goblins, or the Wayfarers. We brought that up earlier as 2 of the best champion lineups for Summoner Wars 2nd Edition. My struggle with Fallen Kingdom for a long time was I kept wanting to... I would discard all these commons, and then I'd say, like, oh wait, now I'm going to summon these champions and they're bad, and I just, kind of waste my time with them. So that, I think, is probably the biggest change in terms of like the meta game of how you go about the strategy for your decks. What do you think, Aaron?
Yeah, I think that definitely plays into it a little bit. You were probably a lot better first edition player than I was. I was never that good at first edition. I wasn't bad by any means. I only played like 1 or 2 of the tournaments. I was pretty late to like the first edition tournament scene, so I didn't play it a whole lot, but I didn't ever play. I think different aspects really helped carrying over. Like gate placement, I think is a big thing that carries over a little bit. And if you've never played the game before, gate placement might be a bit more of like a learning curve and stuff like that. I didn't play as champ heavy in first edition, which is probably part of why I wasn't as good. And so I tend to not take that notion from first edition into second edition. But I think like one of the biggest changes from like first edition to second edition is just how much more theme there is into these decks and how much more strategy is all based in one place. And what I mean by that is like there were strategies and like things put forth by the first edition decks, but it was a lot more loose. Guild Dwarves were strong and they could destroy your gates. And so those different aspects weren't as thematic or like as straightforward, whereas like you look at Fungal Dwarves, for example, and Fungal Dwarves want to do like infections. They want to build this engine. They want to build this diamond around Cool Deck. Or you look at Crimson Order and they're trying to bring back all their cultists and they're trying to heal Daymar and use the warriors. Like there's a lot more direction, I feel like, in second edition than there was in first edition. And I think that helps me personally as a player, because in first edition I just flailed a lot more with my decks, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah, I actually never really thought about it like that, but it seemed like a heavier emphasis on champions, and so I was trying to think of like how first edition may influence second edition play, and I think that's the perfect example. Yeah, commons feel more impactful, but Jessica, I'm kind of with you on the champions just do cooler stuff sometimes, and sometimes I'll play a faction not even for the summoner, but for the champions I want to see in action. Sometimes I feel like Vanguard's Colleen does more overall than Sarah did for me in the game. I don't know. It's just some of those games. So yeah, interesting to hear you guys' perspective on it. I think that covers a lot of the, I guess, general strategies. I mean, you'll kind of notice the pattern here. They kind of all link into each other, like matchup analysis, strategy, how to pivot in the middle of that, and kind of think through your cards. It sounds like an echo chamber, but really it is kind of some of the higher level fundamentals that I feel any aspiring competitive players should kind of hone in on their skills and be disciplined on. Vexer, I'm not sure if you have anything else you want to add.
No, I'm not. I think I'm good there. Like we touched some of like the journal stuff. The thing is, all of these subjects are really interesting from the perspective that, I mean, we could spend like an hour talking just about the difference with gates, like the circumstances and how you use them this way and this other way. But I think we have enough content right now. It's hard to get more in depth without spending like another hour talking about all these things, because there's still a lot to elaborate about these things, right? That we said we did a good job in between the back and forth to cover some of the most important ones.
Well, one last way to get better is find a player that is playing at a higher level than you, whether it's one of the players on this podcast or somebody else, and ask them for tips, ask them for advice, ask them to play some matches with you. That's always a good way to learn. I remember when Vexer first started playing the game, I used to beat Vexer, and that's not the case anymore. Nobody beats Vexer anymore. So that's just how it is. I mean, players, you're going to grow and you're going to learn more, and you do that a lot by learning from the players who have already learned the things you're trying to learn. So, well, we appreciate you guys being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah, always a pleasure to be here.
This has been Discard for Magic, and we'll see you guys in a couple weeks.